Hello, and welcome to our Advocacy 101 workshop. My name is Bobby Tillett, and I am Senior Manager for Member Services and Technical Assistance at the Core Network. I'm really excited to welcome you all to this conversation, where we'll have the Core Network's Government Relations team talking about the best ways for you to communicate your core program to important stakeholders and decision makers. Before we get started, I wanted to direct you to a few different ways that you can engage with your fellow attendees. To the right of the window, you will find a chat window as well as a Q&A feature. Via the chat, you can communicate with other attendees who are watching simultaneously. In the Q&A feature, you can direct questions to our presenters or to Core Network staff that we will jump in and answer at a later date. Also below this window, you will find the materials for today's session, including the workshop slides or any links or documents that were shared. Now I'd like to welcome our presenters for today's session. We have Danielle Owen, Director of Government Relations, and Meghan Castellano, Government Relations Coordinator for the Core Network. I will pass it over to Danielle and Meghan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today we'll be looking at Advocacy 101, the basics of core advocacy. We'll be talking about the importance of advocacy, how to advocate, and what to advocate for. This presentation is a launch point to understand the importance of cores participating in advocacy. Before we begin, we'll briefly go over what we'll be covering in each section of the presentation. First, we'll look at the mechanics of Congress, including how a bill becomes a law, the role and importance of congressional committees, the appropriations process, and why your voice as a constituent especially matters. Then we'll discuss on-the-Hill advocacy, including how to schedule, prepare for, and conduct advocacy meetings. We'll also cover best practices for following up after a meeting. After that, we'll talk about a variety of common and well-known off-the-Hill advocacy strategies, including action alerts, ongoing email advocacy, and local opportunities for congressional engagement. We'll go on to discuss the start of advocating on a specific issue from the first idea through the sustained advocacy engagement. This will include the process for coming up with ideas, identifying solutions, developing key advocacy messaging and materials, and engaging with policymakers. Once we've covered how to identify issues and potential solutions, we'll look at what some of the specific issues cores can discuss when advocating, highlighting several core-focused issues that would be beneficial to bring up during advocacy meetings. Please note this is a high-level overview of some of those issues that we've been advocating for and not all of them. Finally, we'll briefly go over how to talk about cores to a bipartisan audience by making sure you understand your audience, do your research beforehand, and understand that parties are very diverse. So different people might have different opinions despite being in the same party. So let's start by looking at how a bill becomes a law. In each Congress, about 20,000 bills are introduced, but ultimately only 10% of those bills actually become law. If you've ever seen Schoolhouse Rock's I'm Just a Bill, we're going to be covering the same steps for how a bill becomes a law. First, a bill is drafted. Members of Congress, the executive branch, and even outside groups can draft bills. Here we're going to focus specifically on the route of a bill through the House. So the bill is introduced in the House by a member of Congress. After that bill has been introduced, the Speaker of the House sends the bill to a committee. Ultimately, most bills die here in committee. Committees may not hear debate on the bills. They might postpone action, amend, or vote on the bill. But if the bill passes, it goes to the House Rules Committee. The House Rules Committee decides the rules for debate and when the bill will come up for debate. Then the bill is brought to the House floor, where members of Congress debate the bill and may add amendments. And if a majority of representatives vote in favor of the bill, then it goes to the Senate. So just like in the House, if once the bill is introduced, it gets sent to committee. If the majority of votes in the committee are for the bill, then it goes to the whole Senate. In the Senate, the majority floor leader decides when the whole Senate will consider the bill. Similarly to the House, the bill is debated and any amendments may be added. If the majority of votes are in favor of the bill, it is returned back to the House. If the Senate makes any changes, the bill goes back to the House, and if they reject any of the changes, the bill goes to a conference committee of members from both chambers of Congress. Here they work out a compromise. Both chambers must approve changes made by the conference committee and vote on the compromise legislation. And if the bill is approved, then it goes to the president. The president may sign or veto the bill, and if the bill is approved, it becomes law. If the president vetoes the bill, it can still become law if 2/3 of both chambers vote to override the veto. The next slide is a chart to help break down this process. So this is a visual representation of what I just explained, with the House in blue and the Senate in green. Please note that not all bills start in the House. And I will turn it over to Danielle to talk about the appropriations process.
Thank you, Megan. So we'll now go over the appropriations process. This process includes the consideration of 12 regular appropriations bills annually. The process follows the fiscal calendar. So unlike a normal calendar year, the fiscal calendar runs from October 1st to September 30th. The House and Senate Appropriations Committees are both organized into 12 subcommittees, with each subcommittee having responsibility for developing one regular annual appropriations bill. An example is the House Labor, Health, and Human Services Subcommittee. This subcommittee has jurisdiction over the Department of Labor and AmeriCorps. Any bill may begin in either the House or the Senate, but traditionally appropriations or money bills originate in the House, and the Senate considers and amends the House-passed bills. In the next slide, we'll go look at a chart that will help make the appropriations process a bit clearer. So here's a visual representation of the appropriations process. It shows how the entire process begins when the president releases his annual budget request. So the president's budget is traditionally submitted to Congress on the first Monday in February. After the president submits the budget proposal to Congress, each federal agency normally provides additional detailed justification materials to the House and Senate appropriations committees or subcommittees with jurisdiction over its funding. So the next step is passing Congress adopting a budget resolution. Think of the budget resolution as a guide for the House and Senate as they consider various budget-related bills. It's called a concurrent resolution because it's an agreement between the House and Senate that establishes overall budgetary and fiscal policy to be carried out through subsequent legislation. So the budget resolution must cover at least 5 fiscal years. So that's the upcoming fiscal year plus the 4 following fiscal years. The budget resolution sets total new budget authority and outlay levels for each fiscal year covered by the resolution. Once the appropriations committees receive their spending ceilings, those are referred to as 302A allocations. They separately subdivide the amount among their respective 12 subcommittees. So that's providing spending ceilings for each subcommittee. That's referred to as 302B suballocations. This budget resolution is not sent to the president and does not become law. The budget resolutions are under the jurisdiction of the House and Senate committees on the budget. All right, so the next step is when the House and the Senate Appropriations Committees really get to work on the bills. The president submitted his budget. The House and Senate Appropriations Subcommittees now hold hearings on the segments of the budget under their jurisdiction. The witnesses at these hearings are primarily agency officials. For example, again, the Secretary of Labor would testify before the House and Senate Appropriations, Labor, Health, and Human Services, Education-Related Agency Subcommittee on the Department of Labor's budget request. After conducting these hearings, the House and Senate Appropriations Committees make their suballocations, and the subcommittees begin to draft, mark up, and report the regular bills under their jurisdiction to their respective full committees. For the past couple of years, the Senate has not been drafting, marking up, and reporting appropriations subcommittee bills. Instead, they have released bill text and used that for their negotiations with the House. Both appropriations committees should consider each subcommittee's recommendations separately. The committees may adopt amendments to a subcommittee's recommendations prior to reporting the bills and making them available for further consideration by their respective chambers. So now we'll take a look at how the House considers appropriations bills. Prior to floor consideration of an appropriations bill, the House almost always considers a special rule reported by the House Rules Committee that sets parameters for floor consideration of the bill. Floor action for appropriations bills in the House usually begin with 1 hour of general debate on the bill. The debate includes opening statements by the chair and ranking minority member of the Appropriations Subcommittee with jurisdiction over the regular bill, as well as other interested representatives. After this 1 hour of debate, amendments to the bill are then considered. After debate on the various amendments has concluded, the House then votes on the amendments and final passage of the bill. After House passage, the bill is then sent to the Senate. So now we'll take a look at how the Senate considers appropriations bills. Prior to the past couple of years, the practice had been for the full Senate to consider the text of a bill as reported by its Appropriations Committee in the form of a substitute to the House-passed appropriations bill. The Senate does not have a device like the House does for a special rule to set parameters for consideration of bills. Before taking up the bill, however, or during its consideration, the Senate sometimes sets those parameters by unanimous consent. So unanimous consent is an agreement on any question or matter before the Senate that sets aside a rule of procedure to expedite proceedings. Many requests for unanimous consent, also called UC, are routine, but if any senator objects, the request is rejected. When the bill is brought up on the floor, the chair and ranking minority member of the Appropriations Subcommittee make opening statements on the contents of the bill as reported. Senators may propose amendments to any portion of the bill at any time it is pending, unless the Senate agrees to set limits. Once both chambers have passed their versions of an appropriations bill, the process then moves to conference. So the House and the Senate must approve the same measure in precisely the same form before it may be presented to the Senate President for signature or veto. The House and Senate will likely not approve appropriations bills that are written in precisely the same form. This means the two chambers will have to convene a conference committee to resolve the differences in their bills. An alternative approach to a conference committee is for agreement to be reached through an exchange of amendments between the two chambers. Completion of the conference is not on a specified timeline, so negotiations are concluded only when a majority of the conferees from each chamber sign the conference report. The House and Senate then vote on the conference report. Next is presidential action. Once the conference report has passed both chambers, the appropriations bill is sent to the president to be signed or vetoed. Under the Constitution, after a measure is presented to the president, they have 10 days to sign or veto the measure. If the president vetoes the bill, it's sent back to Congress. Congress may override the veto by a 2/3 vote in both chambers. If Congress successfully overrides the veto, the bill becomes law. If Congress is unsuccessful, the bill dies. We'll now look at an alternate approaches to this process on the next slide. So the process I just described is essentially how the annual appropriations process should work. Unfortunately, it's been a number of years since the U.S. Congress has passed the annual spending bills in this manner. Instead, they are using alternate approaches. We'll cover those now. So continuing resolutions, we'll talk about that now. If action on one or more regular appropriations measures has not been completed by the start of the fiscal year, so on October 1st, the agencies funded by those bills must cease non-expected activities due to lack of budget authority. This is when you will hear talk of a federal government shutdown. Traditionally, temporary funding has been provided in the form of a joint resolution to allow agencies or programs to continue to obligate funds at a particular rate, such as the rate of operations for the previous fiscal year. It's for a specific period of time, which may range from a single day to an entire fiscal year. These measures are known as continuing resolutions or CRs. Basically, a CR is used to keep the federal government funded and fully operating until the appropriations process can be settled. In recent years, we have seen more and more of what is referred to as omnibus appropriations bills. The appropriations process is meant to be Congress considering and approving each regular appropriations bill separately, but they will also combine several bills into a single legislative vehicle prior to enactment. These packages are referred to as omnibus appropriations measures. In these cases, Congress typically begins consideration of each regular bill separately, but has generally combined some of the bills together at a later stage in the legislative process, particularly while one or more is in conference. During conference on one of the regular appropriations bill, the conferees have typically added to the conference report the final agreements on other outstanding regular appropriations bills, thereby creating an omnibus appropriations measure. Omnibus bills may provide the full text of each regular appropriations bill included in the bill, or may incorporate the full text by reference. Omnibus bills may also be in the form of full-year continuing resolutions. Packaging regular appropriations bills can be an efficient means for resolving outstanding differences within Congress or between Congress and the President. The negotiations may be able to make more convenient trade-offs between issues among several bills and complete consideration of appropriations using fewer measures. Omnibus measures may also be used to achieve a timely end to the annual appropriations process. Looking ahead to the upcoming fiscal year 2024, Senators Murray and Collins, Chair and Ranking Member of the Senate Appropriations Committee, have said they will be working together to mark up individual appropriations bills and at least bring the Senate back to the normal appropriations process. Meghan, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Danielle. So moving on, we're going to talk about why constituent voices matter. One of the most important parts of the legislative process is the role that constituents play in it. As we previously discussed, thousands of bills are introduced during a term of Congress, but only a small percentage of those bills actually become law. So it's clear that the legislative process takes time. It's important to weigh in on your representatives' policy priorities by letting them know what's important to you. Try to start a conversation with your representative's office by introducing yourself and making them aware of your core and what your core does. That way you're putting your core on their radar screen. Once you've met with your member of Congress or your senator, they need to hear from you on a consistent basis. The goal of this outreach is to keep the conversation going between your core and your elected officials for the long haul. Forming and maintaining that relationship will increase the likelihood of the elected official's office becoming invested in your core. Constituent outreach is a great opportunity for staff, partners, and other stakeholders in the core community to let elected officials know the impact cores have in rural and urban areas across the country, and more specifically in their congressional district or state. If you don't tell Congress who you are and what you do, who else will? You are your own best advocate. Contact your elected officials to advocate and educate them on the details of what you actually do. This is, the mechanisms of your program and your project work. It is so important that we all contribute our voices to public policy discussions that directly impact cores. So now that we've covered some of the mechanics of Congress, we can discuss on the Hill advocacy. To schedule a meeting, you need to start by contacting your representative or senator and ask what the procedure is to request a meeting with their office. If you're unsure of your representative, you can use the Find Your Rep feature on the House website for House members or the Senate directory feature on the Senate's website for Senate members. Your request for a meeting will more than likely be made via email, although some offices require online requests through their website. Very rarely will offices schedule meetings over the phone. When submitting your meeting request, make sure to include the following information: a brief description about who you are and what your organization does, the dates and times you would be available to meet. It's good to offer multiple dates and times up front. Topics for discussion. This is going to be your reason for meeting. The meeting can be an introduction to your organization and the work you do, or it can be about specific legislation in relation to the work that you do. A list of meeting participants, include who else is coming to the meeting, their org and their title in the email, and the primary contact information for the meeting lead. This is often going to be the person doing the outreach. So before meeting, learn your representative or senator's interests. Do some research by reviewing their website, reading their bio, seeing which committees they serve on, and reading recent press releases. If you're meeting with a staffer as opposed to a member of Congress or senator, which we'll talk about more a bit later, It may also help to do a bit of research on the staffer in regard to what other offices they worked for in the past. Try to keep it local. Make a document answering what connection does the representative's district or senator's state have to your Corps? Have they done a site visit before? What projects are you doing in their district or state? It's always good to use a local story if possible. If you're in person, prepare a packet of materials containing handouts, support letters, testimonies, infographics, your contact information. If you're virtual, you can send any of these documents along beforehand. That might be helpful to provide a bit of context for the meeting. But this will also help you further communicate your point and be good leave-behind material for the staffer to reference later if need be. Try to keep the initial discussion short so that the elected official or staffer also has time to speak. Try to keep the meeting conversational and not feeling like you're talking at them. So try to be comfortable by planning and rehearsing. You can do this by having a basic outline of how you want the meeting to go. Especially if you're meeting with a group of people, discuss beforehand who will lead the meeting and decide who will take lead on each topic, as well as who will take meeting notes for your groups. Try to be prepared to be interrupted with questions. If you don't know the answer to a question, never be afraid to say, I don't know, but I will follow up with the answer. It's always better to say, I don't know, than to give an incorrect answer. Finally, plan to end your meeting on a positive note and restate any action items that came out of the meeting. Is there information that you need to get back to the office about after your meeting? Is there information that the office needs to get back to you about after the meeting? If so, restate that so everyone is aware. So now that we've covered that, let's talk about typical meeting flow. So we're going to start the meeting by thanking the representative or staff for taking the meeting. As I mentioned before, don't be surprised if you're meeting with a staffer as opposed to an elected official. The schedules of elected officials are constantly in flux as they have many hearings and markups and meetings to attend throughout the day, and they depend on their staffer to represent them in meetings. So the staffers will often be your touch point in these offices. After you've thanked them, go into introduction of participants, the typical name, pronoun, organization, title. And if you're in person, when you introduce yourself, pass along your business card when it's your turn to talk. Then discuss what your organization does and make your high-level points. Avoid getting into the weeds as it might be a bit confusing for initial introductory meetings, and it's important to keep things high level and easy to follow, at least for the first initial meeting. Explain your work in their state or district and how it relates to your legislative priorities, as well as the Core Network's legislative priorities. Danielle will discuss this a bit more later on. Make sure you have your asks and see if they have any questions. Have a clear ask, such as introducing a bill or co-sponsoring legislation. Once you've made your ask how you can help them. You can ask what you can do in their state or district that is helpful for them, or you can ask what their goals are in these areas, such as amplifying a message or making a connection. And be sure to end the meeting on a positive note. Restate any action items and do your best to work in follow-up items. Incorporating follow-up into the conversation is an easy way to maintain dialogue and build relationships. Finally, thank them again and invite them to visit your program. Program visits can be helpful for congressional offices to get a better understanding of the real work Corps are doing and offers them a chance to hear directly from Corps members. You will likely be asked more questions about what a site visit might entail and potential dates, so be sure to get in contact with the office's scheduler. Now we will talk about post-meeting follow-up. So you'll want to start by emailing a thank you note within a couple days. Make this thank you note engaging and incorporate an action item, not just a thanks. Email is the best practice rather than traditional mail, since traditional mail goes through a screening process and can take a considerable amount of time to arrive at your representative or senator's Washington, D.C. office. Reiterate one or two things that were discussed during the meeting. This shows you're really engaged and also reminds the staffer what was discussed. Be sure to provide materials and information that was requested of you during the meeting. And be sure you can also reach out to a representative or senator's local office. This is a great first action item. Update them on the conversation you had in your meeting and the outcomes. Local staff are always looking for places in the elected officials' community to visit and are often the first ones who will visit your core. So try to extend a site visit around April or August recess. Update your representative or senator as needed on key activities within their district or state. You can share about things such as core graduations and completed projects. And try to maintain relationships through routine communication. Follow-up is one of hopefully many different types of engagements. A good way to do this is to share upcoming events or press releases to keep the office in the loop about what is going on with your core. And feel free to include the Core Network's government relations team on any outreach you're doing. Danielle and I are happy to assist. So with that, I will pass it back to Danielle to talk about Off the Hill advocacy.
Thank you, Megan. So now we'll take a look at Off the Hill advocacy and what that entails. First, we'll talk about action alerts. So what is an action alert? It's essentially a call for action on a timely issue in order to affect a desired outcome. Who initiates an action alert? It'll likely be the core network, but you could also receive them from other external partners that you work with. Some examples of action alerts include support letters, national call-in days, and legislation co-sponsor drives. One note on this is to please make sure you read the entire alert and review any attached materials and/or links. It is always best if you know exactly what is being asked of you. So now we'll talk about email a little bit. Why email? So today, email is the standard way of communicating. It's quick and it's easy to track and reference for all. It also allows for an efficient exchange of large quantities of information and material. Consistent email helps facilitate strong relationships, creates a two-way dialogue that increases familiarity, and allows you and your correspondent to support one another. So when to CC someone? CC someone from the Core Network's government relations team on anything initiated by the Core Network or related to national issues priorities. When to BCC? Feel free to BCC someone from the Core Network's government relations team on emails that do not contain confidential information or is about a program-specific issue. Including TCN's GR team in emails keeps us informed on what offices have an awareness of cores and allows us to be informed if you need or want any assistance in your advocacy efforts. Now we'll cover the do's and do nots of email advocacy. Do be thorough and concise with your email. Remember, you are competing for attention. Customize the email with your organization's information, letterhead, where applicable. Customize the email with information on how the issue being discussed affects your organization. Try to not just copy and paste when possible. Again, do not just copy and paste. Make the email personal to your core. No one wants to read a form email. Also, do not spam the office with unnecessary emails. A healthy level of communication when there is no issue to discuss would be every few weeks when there's a program update to share. We'll cover site visits and special events now. So site visits are the best type of advocacy. Inviting government officials and staff is the best way to make them familiar with your program and your issues. This is vital to building strong relationships. Be aware that you should reach out well in advance to give offices proper time for planning and coordination. Reference TCN's 118th Congressional Outreach Form for office contacts, or reach out to the Core Network's government relations team if you need help identifying the best point of contact for your government official's office. So the next slide will go over inviting your representative or senator to visit. So when should you plan to invite your representative or senator to an event? April and August recess are great times. Representatives, senators, and their staff typically use these recess times in April and August to head back home to their states and districts and meet with constituents. This is prime time for staff, partners, and other stakeholders in the CORE community to let members of Congress know the impact COREs are having across the country. Be sure to reach out to your representative's, senator's office in the weeks leading up to these recesses. Do not wait until the recess has started, because their schedule could fill quickly. You can also reach out at times outside of April and August recess. Government officials will return to their districts for shorter recesses and other events. Don't be afraid to reach out about site visits outside of the April and August recess. So what kind of events should you invite your elected officials to? Project visits, CORE member graduations, partnership forums, roundtable discussions. These are great ideas. So how do you go about inviting your elected official to visit with you? Determine the event type, write up a few details to fold into an invitation, send this invitation via email. Make sure to send a few weeks prior to the date of the event. Don't be afraid to follow up and reflag your initial email if you've not received a response. This is common, and schedulers often keep a list of possible recess events for their representative or senator to do. Again, reach out to the TCN GR team if you need help with office contacts. If you confirm the event, please notify TCN's GR team and follow up with the representative senator staff to coordinate on the event. I recommend putting together an event memo. It'll help the event to run smoother. The memo would contain the location, date, time, event overview, agenda, points of contact. Will there be media present, and any other information your elected official would require? Reach out to the representative senator's communications team to discuss a press release for the event and any social media they will be using. The CORE Network's communications and government relations teams can support communications and social media efforts. It should also include who all the participants will be. Representative senators will want to know who will be there, who else will be speaking, sitting with them. Prepare CORE members to engage with your elected official. Consider identifying one or two CORE members who are comfortable speaking with the elected official on the CORE's behalf. Also, plan, rehearse any talking points, key asks you will be making during the visit. There's post-event follow-up that will need to be done as well. Again, talk with the representative senator's communications team regarding social media exposure. What are they posting on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram? Send thank you notes via email and send any requested materials if there are any needed. On the next slide, you'll see an example of a site visit. Representative Mike Simpson visited with the Student Conservation Association Idaho AmeriCorps program. Rep. Simpson is an example of a priority member of Congress as he holds seats on two key appropriations committees. He's chairing the House Appropriations Interior Environment Subcommittee and is a member of the Labor HHS Subcommittee. It's important to target key members of Congress, but a relationship should be made with your representative senator regardless of their committee assignments. At this event, Rep. Simpson saw a crew performing a Forest Service campground rehabilitation project. This was a successful site visit because it featured project work supported by several federal funding streams. And honestly, it was in a great location for photo ops, increasing the likelihood of its public promotion by the Congressman's communications team. Meghan, I'll turn it back over to you now.
In this section, we'll look at how an idea becomes an advocacy action. Please note, while there are 4 steps in this section, these steps are not linear or distinct. Start by asking, what are the needs? This step is about idea generation and idea coalescing. Issues are deemed advocacy priorities when one or more of the following happens. You recognize an issue directly impacting your core. The needs of a core are so unique and diverse, there may be an issue that mainly impacts your core that you believe needs to be talked about. Alternatively, multiple cores raise an issue. Several cores recognize that they face the same problem and decide to act on it. Or the third way, the core network identifies an opportunity or a network-wide trend that requires action. Coalition engagement is a good strategy to ensure an issue is deemed an advocacy priority. The core networks coalition include the Public Land Service Coalition, the PLSC, and the State and Local Projects Coalition, the SLPC. These are platforms where cores can make the core network and other cores aware of an issue. The coalitions can also support issue advocacy in all 4 idea to action steps outlined here. An issue can also become an advocacy priority through individual outreach to the core network's government relations team. We can only address an issue if we know about it, and we're here as a resource and very willing to help. Next, we're going to look at what are the solutions. In this step, we're brainstorming what potential solutions could be. You need to go to offices with ideas to how to fix the issues you're facing. So after doing necessary background research and evidence gathering, the core network and affected cores can work together to find what these solutions could be. Realistically, there may be more than one potential solution. Advocacy can also concurrently occur for multiple solutions. So solutions can include a bunch of different things, including freestanding legislation, amendments to existing legislation, legislative report language, appropriations report language, congressional letters of support, agency engagement, educating agency staff about an issue, advocating for policy change, and agency guidance to the field. Now we're going to talk about what's the plan. This section is focused on strategy and messaging development. We're thinking about how are we attacking this issue, and how are we framing our message. After identifying the potential solutions, advocacy requires argument development, which is research, evidence gathering, and core input to create an argument and craft messaging for congressional and agency engagement. Staff often ask, what is the impact, or why is this a problem? And we need to have an answer. Advocacy also requires engagement mapping, identifying which offices, agencies, and external partners need to be engaged in order for this effort to be successful. Finally, advocacy requires messaging and material development. We need to work on creating materials and talking points to support advocacy. This can include issue-specific talking points, handouts, or one-pagers, op-eds, blogs, and/or social media. Next, I'm going to turn it back to Danielle to talk about our congressional priorities.
Thanks, Meghan. Before we get into our congressional priorities, just want to give a little disclaimer on these priorities and on these activities. This is by no means all the issues we advocate for. We understand not all cores are impacted by all of the following issues. These are just a few of the issues that have been prominent in our advocacy over the past few years. This is also a very high-level overview of these issues. Also, just a disclaimer on political activity. Please keep in mind that organizations that receive federal funds should keep any political and advocacy activities completely disassociated with those federal grant activities. If your organization receives federal funds, you can participate in advocacy activities on your own time using non-federal funds. Most of this advocacy activity should be considered education. The GR team is always available to provide more detailed information on these topics if you're interested. So on this next slide, I will briefly cover we'll be briefly covering the following topics. These are our 2023 congressional priorities. They include fiscal year 2024 appropriations, Public Lands Core Act cost share waiver, AmeriCorps participant status, AmeriCorps 80/20 rule, AmeriCorps public-private issue, and usage of direct hiring authorities. So we'll first go over fiscal year 2024 appropriations. Every appropriation cycle, we traditionally focus on 2 appropriation subcommittees. Those are the Labor, Health, Human Services, and Education Subcommittee. It has jurisdiction over the Department of Labor and AmeriCorps. The other is the Interior, Environment, and Related Agencies Subcommittee. It has jurisdiction over the Department of the Interior and the U.S. Forest Service. For the Labor HHS Subcommittee, we are asking for funding at the Department of Labor's Employment and Training Administration to provide service and conservation corps with the resources and support to administer comprehensive youth and workforce development programs for their participants. Funding will support the development and implementation of curricula and training, including pre-apprentice and apprenticeship programs. Also, for the Labor HHS Subcommittee, we are asking for increased funding in AmeriCorps State and National, State Service Commissions, National Civilian Community Corps, and the National Service Trust for Education Awards. We are requesting that the minimum living allowance be raised to the equivalent of $15 an hour, and the limitation on total grant amount per AmeriCorps member also be raised. The current low living allowance is a disincentive for all applicants, including those who would benefit most from a service opportunity. Additionally, without an increase in the grant awards cost per member, the burden of increasing the living allowance falls to the grantee to raise significant additional funds. For the Interior Environment Subcommittee, we are asking for funding at the Department of the Interior and the U.S. Forest Service to support land management and natural resource accounts that support and bolster community resiliency, conserve and restore public lands and waters, increase reforestation, protect biodiversity, improve access to recreation and other needs. We ask that they designate a percentage of existing and/or new appropriations for Service and Conservation Corps project work in lieu of a single appropriation. So on this next slide, we'll discuss the waiver for Public Lands Corps Act cost share. So the Public Lands Corps Act requires a 25% cost share on Public Lands Corps Act projects. We are advocating for a waiver to this cost share. With the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, there's great potential in growing the funding for Service and Conservation Corps projects on our federal lands and waters. This potential will not be met if Service and Conservation Corps are required to pay a 25% cost share on these federal funds. Two pieces of legislation that could be used to achieve this waiver or to set legislative precedent for a waiver are the Simplifying Outdoors Access for Recreation Act, or the SOAR Act. This bill was introduced in the 116th Congress by former Representative Deb Haaland and in the 117th Congress by Representative Joe Neguse. This legislation contains language waiving cost share for projects funded through it. It is expected to be reintroduced during the 118th Congress. That's our current Congress. The other legislative vehicle is the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is expected to be reauthorized during the 118th Congress. Legislative text could be included in this legislation to waive Public Lands Corps Act cost share on U.S. Forest Service funded projects. There would be no cost included for this. Due to it being included in the Farm Bill, it would not have jurisdiction over the Department of the Interior, but would set a legislative precedent. So in the next slide, we'll talk about participant status. A technical correction is needed to align the meaning of participants enrolled for terms of service in the federally run Public Lands Corps National Service Program, with the meaning of participants as defined in the underlying legislation through which the Public Lands Corps was created. This is the National Community Service Trust Act, or NCSTA. There's a lack of definition and clarity around what being a participant means in the PLC section, even though it's authorized through the NCSTA. Individual participants and corps are left in legal limbo with no clarity around what participant means for employment classification during their terms of service. This clarification would provide a consistent and clear base for PLC to expand and develop new service opportunities. So our request is if either the House Education and the Workforce Committee or the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee decides to begin work on a reauthorization of the National Community Service Trust Act, we would request that this technical fix be included. The next slide is the AmeriCorps 80-20 rule. So what is the 80-20 rule? This is an important rule that affects professional development and training for AmeriCorps members. This rule mandates that members can spend no more than 20% of their overall service time on educational and development activities. Programs are expected to train their members for their service term, provide professional development and skill building, and facilitate personal development, all within this 20% cap. It's a large task for even the most well-resourced programs. AmeriCorps is fairly vague about how this time must be spent and provides few resources to help guide professional development training. Instead, it's up to the grantee organization to decide how to effectively use the time. The 80-20 rule can lead to the potential that Corps members may end up without the workforce readiness skills necessary to transition to a job or educational opportunity after their term of service. We are asking for flexibility and/or a waiver to be provided to participants to spend more than 20% of their time on workforce development or education if there is a demonstrated need and/or tied to the needs of a project they are working on. Next slide is about the AmeriCorps public-private issue. We are asking that AmeriCorps allow members to serve on projects with public benefit that are on or in private lands or private buildings. Expanding the range of allowable AmeriCorps service activities to include more public-private partnerships that can take place on private lands and in private buildings where public benefit is obvious, such as wildfire-related projects or weatherization projects for low-income housing, will broaden the number of projects that AmeriCorps members can participate in. Weeds and wildfires don't stop at property lines. Droughts impact watersheds spanning federal, state, and private lands. Mitigation of urban heat islands necessitates solutions that include private properties within municipalities. This technical adjustment could be made by AmeriCorps directly, and the Service and Conservation Corps community is actively advocating for the agency to do so. We could use the help of the U.S. Congress in this advocacy. We ask that our members of Congress and senators ask for AmeriCorps to make this technical adjustment. On this next slide, we'll discuss increased uniformity and utilization of the Public Lands Corps and Resource Assistant Program hiring authorities. Service and Conservation Corps have two existing hiring authorities through the Public Lands Corps Act that facilitate onboarding of Service and Conservation Corps graduates into federal land management agencies at the Departments of the Interior and Agriculture, as well as NOAA. Calling attention to these authorities as eligible career pathways and related legislation would help promote broader utilization and encourage agencies to incorporate them as a workforce development strategy. We know that the federal workforce is aging and that many departments and agencies are struggling with hiring. Increasing the usage of these hiring authorities could help with both of these issues. Meghan, I'll turn it back over to you.
Finally, we'll discuss the best way to advocate in the 118th Congress. We all know that the current Congress is divided. The House is controlled by Republicans and the Senate is controlled by Democrats. When advocating, it is important to know your audience. Words have an impact, and how you frame your words may have an even bigger impact. In today's political climate, the words you use to talk might resonate with a Democrat's office differently than they do with a Republican's office, and vice versa. As we discussed before, when preparing for a meeting, it is important to do your research on the office you're meeting with. There is lots of information online about members of Congress and senators that can be used when preparing for what you'll be discussing during your meeting. It can be helpful to replicate the language used on an elected official's website back to them. Tailoring your language and doing research on past voting records and where a politician stands on an issue may contribute to finding a new office that is willing to be a champion for CORS. Make a connection back to the community that you share. Elected officials are likely to be more receptive if you tie it back to their district. Share and emphasize the impact you are having in your shared community and on the lives of these young adults. When speaking to an audience that may not be fully on board with climate change or green issues, attempt to emphasize certain things. This can mean disaster response and mitigation, community resilience, conservation efforts, outdoor recreation, job creation, career pathways, and further education. As I mentioned, use the member of Congress or senator's website to see how they talk about the issue and use that language back to them. Making the connection to your shared community is always important, no matter who your audience is. CORs are in many different communities all over the country, represented by both the left and the right. Connecting back to their state or district will help you make your case by tying your advocacy back to their interests. Next, please know that political parties are not monolithic. There are varied levels of support for issues across parties. Not everyone in the party agrees on the same issues. There may be some members of a party that don't support their party on an issue at all. The issues we're discussing are complex issues, and America is so diverse, and different offices may prioritize issues differently compared to the rest of their party to reflect the needs of their district or state. Admittedly, climate seems to be one of the more polarizing issues, but when framed the right way to directly impact a member of Congress or senator's interests, they might be open to a conversation. When advocating, take into account the physical landscape and industries that are prominent in a district or state. For example, a congressional district or state located in the West may have experienced wildfires, while a congressional district located in the Southeast may have experienced hurricanes. Whether they are Republican or Democrat, these offices will look at natural disasters differently. On the industry side, a member of Congress or senator may come from an area where the coal mining or oil industry is more prominent. Again, whether they are Republican or Democrat, having those industries in their community or state could influence their receptiveness to your conversation. This highlights the importance of doing your research once again. Going through a member of Congress or senator's official website or campaign website, looking for their stances on labor, environment, climate change, energy, education, or going on congress.gov to see what bills they've sponsored, co-sponsored, voted for, or what committees or caucuses they're on or a part of is so important. Lastly, please always feel free to reach out to the Core Network's government relations team for help. That's what we're here for. Thank you so much for joining us for our workshop. Please feel free to reach out to either of us should you have any questions or want more information. I'll send it back to you, Bobby.
Thank you, Danielle and Meghan. And I hope you all will take them up on their offer to help you with any sort of advocacy questions or issues that you run into in the future. Like I said before, the session materials will be available for the rest of the conference, and you can find those beneath this video. The Q&A feature will also be open, so feel free to keep posting your questions for Danielle and Meghan. I hope you enjoyed today's session, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your time at CorpsCon23.